And so once more I find myself drawn into an ever-expanding thicket of modern censorship and all the mechanisms that come with it. Now, I've had more than a few people, both here on YouTube and elsewhere, insist we can't give more power to the government. But often what y'all oppose isn't the government per se, it's the corrupt individuals who currently occupy positions of authority. The truth is, government as an institution is not inherently the problem, for if it were composed of moral, accountable people genuinely acting in the public interest, then government could serve its proper function, for it is, after all, simply people. The deeper issue is twofold. A citizenry increasingly unwilling to govern itself, and the political process that reliably empowers individuals who do not act in the interest of those they represent. Furthermore, as I have repeatedly said, censorship ought not be categorically opposed, nor should anyone flinch at the idea of the government exercising that power. The real question is not whether censorship should exist, but who wields it, and to what end. Every society censors. The only variable is what gets censored and by whom. One should be far less concerned with the presence of censorship than with the worldview of those enforcing it. What we need is leaders who are committed to truth, to decency, and the common good, and then entrusting them with that responsibility. Now, the real issue here is that the censorship of today does not always arrive in the form of state bans or explicit deplatformings. No, increasingly it manifests through the coercive power of financial intermediaries, credit card networks, payment processors, and banks, all whom have quietly become the gatekeepers of public participation. This infrastructure, monopolized by entities like Visa and MasterCard, is opaque, unaccountable, and shielded from public recourse by a regulatory regime that protects its own dominance. These companies do not merely process payments, they act as de facto regulators, determining who may or may not participate in economic life and on what terms. Now, the Department of Justice has already affirmed that Visa adds no material value to its payment system. Yet it continues to extract fees and enforce control because there are no alternatives. And so in effect, Americans have been trapped in this closed-loop system that uses state-blessed market dominance to suppress competition and innovation. Meanwhile, meaningful alternatives like IBAN, used widely in Europe, remain unavailable to U.S. citizens. And this is not a result of market failure, but of deliberate legislative and bureaucratic inertia. But the real center of gravity in the modern regime of control lies elsewhere. It sits not on the loud stages of political debate, but in the quiet infrastructure that makes digital life possible. Here in the background, the flow of money is being weaponized to constrain the flow of speech. And unlike all these symbolic culture wars that dominate social media feeds, this battle is rarely discussed in clear terms because it is enforced by private intermediaries with no obligation to explain themselves. Now, I began this entire reflection while observing the continued fallout from the recent Steam purge. A quiet but far-reaching act of digital censorship. And in this case, it wasn't just about Valve delisting degenerate games. It was upstream pressure from payment processors, companies like MasterCard and Visa, cutting off financial services to developers, effectively blacklisting their work without explanation or recourse. And this isn't an isolated incident. We've seen the same pattern unfold with Patreon, PayPal, Stripe, and the banks themselves, all of which have deplatformed various individuals and organizations not for breaking the law, but for ostensibly running afoul of ideological sensibilities. And the implications of this are far more serious than most are willing to admit. We now live in a system where financial access can be quietly revoked by unaccountable private intermediaries, people who act as de facto governors of moral speech. The infrastructure of the internet has grown so centralized that even the appearance of controversy is enough to render a person or a platform financially inert. And this is not merely about decency or offense, it's about how systems of control are coordinated in ways that make protest difficult and recourse nearly impossible. A great example of this is the Kiwi farms. And to understand the depth of the problem, one should look at the career of someone like Josh Moon. For many years now, he has been at the center of fierce controversy, some of it, but far from all of it, justified. Yet in recent days, his arguments about the deeper structure of financial censorship have landed with clarity, and he has framed the issue superbly. Those blaming feminist NGOs for pressuring MasterCard were, in his words, fools, taking the bait. The real issue lies with a global financial architecture that is both unaccountable and legally deputized to act on the behalf of governments, especially the United States. Feminist NGOs are just convenient scapegoats, by design. But the real decision makers are the financial services that operate under the shadow of federal law, immune from civil liability, and incentivized to err on the side of caution at everyone else's expense. Josh's analysis deserves to be taken seriously, even by those who might dislike him or disagree with his rhetorical postures. These companies, these payment processors, they're not the courts. They don't wait for a ruling. They are risk managers, not public servants. And their due diligence obligations, along with their trade secrets, mean they can cut off service without giving reasons or providing a path to appeal. Now, this entire arrangement didn't come out of nowhere, as much as the reactionaries on X and YouTube would like you to believe. It emerged after 9/11, when Title III of the Patriot Act was codified into federal law, expanding the scope of financial surveillance and enforcement. From there, the infrastructure grew. Sections 5311 to 5332 of the U.S. Code govern financial reporting and anti-money laundering efforts. Their statutes criminalize the distribution of obscene material, especially if it depicts violence or targets minors. And none of these laws are theoretical. They provide the legal basis for financial institutions to act preemptively, often in response to vague associations with potential legal risk. Now, I should also mention this does not mean that all deplatformed content deserves protection, because some of it is indeed reprehensible. What matters here is the structure. We do not operate within a framework where the law functions through courts and juries. Instead, the law has been offloaded onto private actors whose decisions are final, opaque, and systemic. So what this means is none of this can be addressed through all these online petitions or moral appeals to platforms. As Josh has put it very bluntly, petitions and crying on the internet will not fix this. We need Congress to pass a bill. And he's right. The system as it exists is the product of federal law. It's not accidental overreach. And if the law treats financial institutions as the front line of national security, then those institutions will act accordingly. Now, here's the thing. If people want that to change, then they must engage the actual sources of power. Legislation, oversight, policy. Don't just engage the symptoms. And this is where the public's pacificity becomes dangerous, because it's not despair but comfort that is the real problem here. Too many people are willing to accept a system that they only barely understand, so long as the consequences do not hit them directly. But when platforms as large as Steam are potentially violating age ID laws because they don't ask for identification to buy pornography, well, you start to realize just how widespread the legal liabilities might be, and just how much enforcement is already happening quietly before a case ever reaches court. So we need to reorient ourselves to the actual shape of power. Power does not always arrive with a boot or a baton. Sometimes it arrives as a customer service form. Sometimes it doesn't arrive at all, and it just disappears you from the network. The response to all this must begin with clarity. If there's no neutral infrastructure, no domain registrars that serve all lawful speech, no payment networks that serve all lawful commerce, then every inch of digital terrain becomes contingent on ideology, discretion, or PR pressure. And as we know, that is not rule of law, that is rule by protocol, and it will be enforced through silence. Now here's the more difficult part. This all begins with a clear-eyed explanation of how these systems operate, and a willingness to defend the truth wherever it is spoken, even when it comes from controversial figures we might not fully endorse. Someone like Josh Moon doesn't fit neatly into anyone's narrative, but given the whole history of the Kiwi Farms and Josh's role in its outstanding presence on the internet, his role in this conversation is an important one, and it ought to be taken seriously and with due consideration. People are upset over Steam censoring games at the behest of the payment networks. People are more upset over a feminist group in Australia taking credit, but this presents a good opportunity to raise awareness of the core problem. MasterCard, Visa, American Express, Discover, their payment processors, and the financial services industry. There is a bill titled Fair Access to Banking Act, which is a nice first step, but not a real solution. Now, I've written at length about payment networks. Many of you are familiar with how the Kiwi Farms is unmonetizable, and my mere association with it has not only led to payment processors demonetizing my other companies, but after forming the United States Internet Preservation Society, 501c4 nonprofit, for the express purpose of petitioning the government to change laws on payment networks, I was indeed denied a payment processor for that because of the principal's background. I'm so thoroughly banned from PayPal, I cannot book an Uber with any credit card number it recognizes as mine. This bill is insufficient to meaningfully help people like me. It is better than nothing, but it has no teeth. First, the bill extensively writes about banks, but the bank in debanking is often not a literal brick-and-mortar bank. If it was, there would not be as many issues. Over 9,000 financial institutions, banks and credit unions operate in the USA. If a bank didn't want to do business with you, that's actually not a huge deal. You could find another bank. Payment processors and payment networks are the bigger issue. When you want to get paid online in the USA, you have to do business with these financial services. The complexity of this mechanism is deliberately designed to obfuscate who is doing what and making which decisions. You and your bank receiving money. The payment processor that negotiates you as a customer. There's sometimes a separate company called a payment gateway that provides an interface between your application and the payment processor. But most modern payment processors roll their own payment gateway. The underwriting banks that maintain a relationship between the payment processors and payment networks. These underwriting banks maintain the direct relationship with the card networks and have a veto on if you get to be a customer of the payment processor. Some payment networks work with multiple underwriting banks. For instance, Citi is a large underwriting bank that is friendly with guns, so NFA merchants will often be paired with Citi for selling guns. And the card networks. These are MasterCard, Visa, Discover, and American Express. When you sign up to process cards, you agree to the terms of service collectively and individually for every single one of these companies. You are agreeing to some of the most complex rules to ever be written, not for a single service, but for the payment processor, payment gateway, underwriting bank, and each of the 4 card networks. If you break any of these rules at any time, you may find yourself immediately unable to make money. And if that happens, you probably won't be told why. Risk management is a trade secret. You have no right to know, and you cannot sue to know. Now, it could have been the payment processor directly, receiving complaints from people who want to deplatform you. It could be the underwriting bank who, for whatever reasons, was unhappy with your transactional volume. If you sell too much or sell too little, then you do an annual sale that suddenly spikes your sales from $0 to a lot. That could be a fraud indicator. It could be a card network that decided you are a reputational risk to their brand. You will never know who, what, when, where, or why, and you will not be given a chance to appeal. And you will not be given information, so even if you try to apply for another card, you won't know what to do right the next time. The proposed law does not address any of this. Instead, what it does is it gives you the option to complain to the Office of the Comptroller of Currency. If the OCC feels bad for you, they may fine the institution up to $10,000. But here's the problem. Last year, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that administrative law judges do not meet the jury requirement of the Constitution. Thus, they cannot impose fines. So, empowering the OCC to fine one of the largest and most powerful companies in human history $10,000 is already a joke, but they actually have no means to enforce it. And even if the fine was enforceable, it's up to the discretion of the OCC to enforce it. And if the OCC doesn't find it politically expedient to help you, they won't. For example, when the Kiwi Farms was being deplatformed by ISPs, we moved infrastructure to Washington State because they had net neutrality as a state law. But here's another problem. It was not a civil cause of action, but rather something the Attorney General of Washington had to impose on the company. The Attorney General was Bob Ferguson, who decided he would not help us. Despite our condition 100% meeting the criteria for a net neutrality violation. For law to have value, it needs to do the following. First, it must create a federal civil relief with statutory damages for lost opportunity, ideally with riders for punitive damages, and also attorneys' costs and fees. As this is a purely financial matter, it must make financial sense to sue one of the largest and most powerful companies in the world. Second, it must undo existing requirements already imposed by the federal government on financial services. Title III of the Patriot Act deputized, in the words of Ron Paul, the financial services to act as a form of law enforcement, one which cannot be appealed and provides no due process. By the time the Patriot Act was not renewed, the vestigial remains of these Title III requirements had been reshuffled into other parts of the USC. I'd also like to take a second to reiterate just how abysmal the payment networks are as a fundamental concept. I have lived outside the US for almost a decade. In Europe, they have the IBAN system. There, your debit card will not have the mark of the beast on it. It is free to pay people with your debit card. It is free and instant to send money. In the US, these card networks charge around 2.9% plus 30 cents for every single card transaction. Now, stores are forbidden by the card terms of service for adding these fees to the purchase price, like they do sales taxes in the US. If you buy $100 of groceries at Walmart, Walmart actually loses $3.20 to the card networks. Walmart, despite making $648 billion in gross sales in 2024, is powerless against the card networks. On that figure alone, with the most conservative estimate, Walmart had to eat shit on almost $19 billion in fees, not including individual transaction fees, which is billions more, as those fees are taken out of gross sales and not net profit. That's Walmart. Imagine how badly this is impacting small businesses. Suppose you have a shop that sells $100 of goods on a 15% margin. Your margin goes down to 11.8% right off the bat just because you have to pay a random company to make money in the US. We are getting fucked. We are getting raped. The companies are raping you. They are raping the country. They are pilfering businesses of all sizes for billions of dollars a year, and then they use that power to break the back of alt tech, blackball individuals from the global economy, and fund DEI initiatives, mass immigration initiatives, and child genital mutilation surgeries. Yes, indeed, when you swipe a Visa or MasterCard, you are paying for little boys to get castrated in the US. So when I see people bickering about stupid shit that doesn't matter, it makes me sick to my stomach. The backs of these companies needs to be broken. They won't go down without a fight, and they will pay for shills to defend them, for organizations to take the blame for their actions. Bribe politicians out the ass. The Department of Justice is currently suing Visa for being a monopoly. Specifically, Visa has near total monopoly on debit cards. They impose anti-competitive practices on banks to somehow force them to issue Visa cards and persuade their customers to use their Visa cards. To quote the Department of Justice, Visa sets fees not based on its costs or competition, but rather relative to the value we provide, i.e. Visa's perception of its own value. The formal opinion of the fucking federal government is that Visa has no value-added service but continues to add fees because you can't do anything about it. That's why they will do whatever it takes to stay in power. They have the easiest, most comfortable, highest profit ratio business model of almost any company to ever exist. And right now, they have a monopoly charter granted to them by the federal government. They will happily spend billions to stay in power because billions is how they measure numbers in their business.